You can't be serious. The young man in the tactical polo shirt sneered, clipboard clutched in one hand. He adjusted his wraparound sunglasses, his gaze traveling with obvious disdain from the old man's weathered face to the wooden rifle in his arms. Is this some kind of history lesson? The Civil War reenactment is next county over, Gramps. Antonio Tony Vasquez, 84 years old, said nothing. His back remained straight despite the weight of years, his feet planted firmly on the concrete of Fort Campbell's civilian marksmanship range. His weathered hands, marked by decades of honest work, gripped the dark stock of his M1 Garand with quiet reverence. The sounds of the modern range, the sharp crack of tactical rifles, the electronic beeping of timer systems, seemed to fade around the quiet space he occupied. The young man, Marcus Webb, was the civilian range coordinator, 28 years old, with a swagger that came from managing military contracts and dealing with elite soldiers daily. He gestured toward a group of men in their 20s unloading equipment cases from a tactical truck. They were 82nd Airborne paratroopers, their unit patches prominently displayed on their range gear. They were laughing, their amusement echoing Webb's contempt as they assembled precision rifles that cost more than most people's cars. "Look, sir," Webb said, his voice deliberately loud enough for the paratroopers to hear. "This is a precision long-range facility. We host active-duty military qualification courses. That antique isn't safe, and frankly you're a liability." He held out his hand with bureaucratic authority. "I need to see your range qualification card, and I need that weapon inspected before I ask you to leave." The confrontation hung in the humid Kentucky air. The young paratroopers, emboldened by Webb's attitude, began drifting closer, forming a loose semicircle of amused spectators. Their own rifles were marvels of modern military technology, black polymer and aircraft aluminum, bristling with optics, lasers and bipods that adjusted with computer precision. Tony's Garand, with its elegant walnut stock and simple iron sights, looked like a museum piece by comparison. "It's safe," Tony said, his voice a low rumble like distant thunder. It held no anger, no defensiveness, only the unshakable certainty of a man who had trusted his life to this rifle in places these young soldiers couldn't imagine. "I'll be the judge of that," Webb snapped, playing to his audience of elite soldiers who clearly found the situation entertaining. One of the paratroopers, a sergeant with a cocky grin and the lean build of someone who lived for physical challenges, stepped forward. "Hey, let the old-timer try," Sergeant Davis said, though his eyes never left Tony. "Maybe he wants to show us how they did it in the Stone Age. Bet you can still hit something the size of a barn with that relic, right, Grandpa?" The other soldiers chuckled, the sound carrying casual cruelty. They saw frailty where there was strength, obsolescence where there was proven effectiveness, a joke where there stood a legend. Tony's gaze remained distant, focused on targets shimmering in the heat haze 1,500 meters away. Webb puffed out his chest, emboldened by the support of his military audience. These paratroopers represented everything modern and elite about the Army. They validated his authority, made him feel part of something important. "Policy is policy," he declared with bureaucratic finality. "No uninspected vintage firearms on my range. Now are you going to hand over that antique, or do I need to call base security and have you escorted out for trespassing?" The threat was unnecessary, designed purely to humiliate. The circle of paratroopers tightened slightly, their earlier laughter fading into predatory curiosity. They wanted to see how the old man would react. Would he argue? Would he tremble? Would he finally break? Tony slowly, deliberately ran his thumb over the Garand. His finger traced a deep, jagged scar in the wood, just below the operating rod. It was a familiar gesture, one he'd performed thousands of times over 60 years. The wood was warm beneath his touch, alive with memory. As his thumb rested on that old wound in the timber, the world around him dissolved. The harsh Kentucky sun was replaced by the gray perpetual overcast of a German winter. The crack of modern rifles became the distinctive chatter of an MG-42, a sound like canvas ripping at inhuman speed. The smell of gun oil and hot concrete was replaced by pine sap, frozen earth, and cordite. He could feel the biting cold seeping through his worn field jacket, the tremor in the ground from artillery impacts miles away. A voice, young and desperate, echoed across the decades. "Tony, they're coming up the left flank. Multiple contacts." He saw muzzle flashes winking from the dark tree line, snow kicking up around his foxhole as machine gun bullets searched for him. Shrapnel, hot and vicious, had screamed past his head during that artillery barrage. One jagged piece had struck his rifle with a violent impact, spinning it in his hands but miraculously deflecting what would have been a fatal blow to his temple. The scar on the rifle was a mirror to the thin silver line that traced his own hairline, hidden now by wisps of white hair. He blinked, and the forest vanished. The memory receded, leaving only sun concrete and the circle of arrogant young faces. While the paratroopers focused on Tony, none noticed a younger soldier standing by a pickup truck in the back row. Private First Class Rodriguez, new to the unit, had been watching the exchange with growing unease. He recognized the swagger his superiors displayed, brittle armor he'd seen them wear often, but the old man's absolute stillness was more intimidating than any sergeant's bluster. Rodriguez had caught a glimpse of the name stenciled on the old man's canvas rifle case when he'd arrived. Vasquez, 101st ABN. The name meant nothing to him, but something about the way the old veteran carried himself sparked professional curiosity and respect. This wasn't some weekend hobbyist. On Tony's faded denim jacket was a small, unassuming patch, the distinctive eagle head of the 21st Airborne Division. But it was an older version, different from the modern ones. Rodriguez felt a knot of shame tighten in his gut as Webb threatened to call security. This was wrong. This violated everything the uniform was supposed to represent, respect for those who had served before them. He moved behind his truck, shielding himself from view, and pulled out his phone. Scrolling through his contacts, he found the one he needed, First Sergeant Martinez, the senior NCO of their entire company. It was a huge risk, jumping the chain of command like this, but his instincts screamed that this was one of those moments when protocol mattered less than doing what was right. The phone rang twice before a gravelly voice answered. Martinez. First Sergeant, this is PFC Rodriguez. I'm sorry to bother you, but I'm at the civilian range off Pennyrile Parkway. Some of our guys from 2nd Platoon are here, including Sergeant Davis. There was a pause. And are they causing problems, Rodriguez? Not exactly, First Sergeant, but sir, there's an elderly veteran. The range coordinator and some of our guys are giving him a hard time. They're about to throw him off the range. That's not really our problem, soldier, Martinez said, annoyance creeping into his voice. Let the civilian authorities handle it. Rodriguez took a deep breath. First Sergeant, his name is Antonio Vasquez. He's carrying an old M1 Garand, and he's got a 101st Airborne patch on his jacket. An old-style one. The silence on the other end was sudden and absolute. It stretched for 10 full seconds. Rodriguez could hear papers rustling, then muffled voices in the background. When Martinez spoke again, his voice had completely changed. Sharp, urgent, stripped of all casual dismissal. Say that name again, Private. Antonio Vasquez, First Sergeant. The guys are calling him Grandpa and mocking his rifle. Another pause, this one crackling with intensity. Rodriguez could feel through the phone. What's his exact location? Main parking area, First Sergeant, by the check-in station. Listen carefully, Rodriguez, Martinez said, his voice deadly serious. Keep your eyes on that man. Do not let him leave. Do not let anyone disrespect him or touch his weapon. Is that understood? Yes, First Sergeant. And Rodriguez, Martinez added, his tone carrying weight that made the young soldier's spine straighten. You did exactly the right thing calling me. The line went dead, leaving Rodriguez staring at his phone with a pounding heart. 20 miles away, at Fort Campbell headquarters, First Sergeant Martinez stood behind his desk, phone still in hand. He looked across the room at his battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel Chen, who was reviewing training schedule. Ma'am, Martinez said, his voice tight with emotion the colonel had rarely heard from her senior NCO. We have a code Eagle. Colonel Chen looked up from her paperwork, confusion flickering across her features. A what? Code Eagle, ma'am. Antonio Vasquez is at the civilian range. He's being disrespected by some of our soldiers. The colonel's pen stopped moving. She slowly placed it down, her eyes locking with Martinez's. The name hit her like a physical blow. Antonio Vasquez, the Ghost of Bastogne. The man who had held Hill 317 with nothing but his rifle and unbreakable will. The instructor whose impossibly high standards had shaped 2 generations of paratroopers, including Colonel Chen herself when she was a young lieutenant, going through airborne school. He was a living legend, a name whispered with reverence in NCO clubs and training schools. Most of the younger generation assumed he was dead. He's being harassed, the colonel asked, her voice dangerously quiet. By some of our own soldiers, ma'am, and a civilian range coordinator. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 20 degrees. Colonel Chen stood up abruptly, her chair scraping harshly against the floor. Her expression was a mask of cold fury that made Martinez take an unconscious step back. "Get the command vehicle," she ordered, her voice like steel on stone. "Full honor detail. Dress uniforms. Now." "Yes, ma'am," Martinez said, already moving toward the door. "And Martinez," the colonel called after him, her voice cutting through the air like a blade. "Bring the ceremonial rifle case. The M1 Garand from the regimental collection." Martinez paused at the door, understanding immediately. An insult to Antonio Vasquez was an insult to the entire history and honor of the WWII Airborne Division. It was a slight that would be answered not with anger, but with a display of respect so profound it would burn itself into the memory of every person present. Back at the range, Webb was savoring his moment of power. The old man remained silent. The paratroopers were watching, and he held all the authority. He was in complete control. "That's it," he declared, taking a decisive step forward. "I've had enough of this disruption." He pointed an accusing finger at Tony. "You are officially trespassed from this facility. Hand over that weapon so I can secure it in my office, while we wait for base security." He reached out, fingers spread, intending to take the Garand from Tony's hand. It was the ultimate act of disrespect. Attempting to disarm a veteran, regardless of age, crossed a sacred line. Tony didn't move. He didn't flinch. He simply held the rifle a little tighter, his gaze finally shifting from the distant targets to meet Webb's eye. In that moment, Webb saw something that made him hesitate. It wasn't anger or fear. It was a calm, fathomless depth that spoke of experiences beyond his comprehension. He felt as if he were staring at a piece of living history, something ancient and formidable that he couldn't possibly understand. Before his hand could make contact, a new sound cut through the Kentucky air. It started as a low rumble, growing steadily louder and more ominous. It wasn't the sound of civilian vehicles or even military transport trucks. It was the unmistakable roar of convoy vehicles moving at emergency speed, their engines synchronized in a powerful chorus that spoke of official business and absolute authority. Heads turned toward the range entrance as 3 black military vehicles, Humvees with command pennants, rolled through the gate with disciplined precision that was anything but routine. The vehicles didn't park in designated spaces. They drove directly onto the range access road, forming a perfect line of military authority. Their engines idled in deep synchronization as doors opened with practiced precision. From the lead vehicle stepped Lieutenant Colonel Chen, her dress blue uniform immaculate, her bearing radiating the absolute command presence that came from leading elite soldiers in combat and peace. Her chest displayed ribbons that told stories of service in multiple conflicts, leadership in the most demanding assignments the Army offered. From the second vehicle emerged First Sergeant Martinez, his face granite hard, followed by a dozen paratroopers in full dress uniform, tan berets, pristine jackets adorned with jump wings and combat patches, polished Garand boots that reflected the Kentucky sun. They moved with silent, terrifying precision, forming 2 perfect ranks behind their commander. This was an honor detail assembled with the kind of urgency reserved for visiting dignitaries or fallen heroes. The mocking paratroopers and Webb stood frozen, mouths agape. This was flag officer level ceremony, formal military protocol that made no sense in response to what they saw as a simple trespassing incident. Colonel Chen ignored the stunned range coordinator and the pale-faced soldiers completely. Her eyes scanned the crowd methodically until they found Antonio Vasquez. She began walking forward, her polished boots striking the concrete with steady rhythmic authority that silenced all conversation. First Sergeant Martinez followed exactly 1 pace behind, his own bearing speaking of decades spent in service to soldiers and standards most people couldn't comprehend. The colonel stopped precisely 3 feet in front of Tony. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, the 2 warriors simply regarded each other, the modern commander and the living legend, separated by decades but united by shared understanding of what service truly meant. Then Colonel Chen's body snapped to the rigid perfection of military attention. She raised her hand in a salute so sharp, so precise, it seemed to cut through the humid air itself. Sergeant Major Vasquez, her voice boomed across the now silent range, carrying the weight of absolute respect and official recognition. "It is an honor, sir." Tony, who hadn't flinched at taunts or threats, seemed to soften slightly. The hard mask of endurance cracked just enough to reveal the man beneath, not just a legend, but a human being who had carried impossible burdens with quiet dignity for over 60 years. He gave a slow, deliberate nod of acknowledgement, his voice quiet but carrying clearly in the stunned silence. "Colonel." The respectful greeting acknowledged not just her rank but the moment, the recognition that the young officer he'd once trained had risen to command the very unit he'd served with such distinction. Colonel Chen held her salute as First Sergeant Martinez stepped forward, turning to face the group of dumbfounded young paratroopers whose expressions had shifted from amusement to dawning horror as they began to understand the magnitude of their mistake. "Listen," Martinez's voice exploded across the range with the authority of a man who had spent 30 years turning civilians into soldiers. The young paratroopers instinctively straightened, their earlier swagger evaporating under the laser focus of his attention. "You stand in the presence of Sergeant Major Antonio Vasquez, retired," Martinez announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the facility. "A man who was jumping into occupied France while your grandfathers were learning to walk." He gestured toward Tony with profound respect. "This soldier is a recipient of the Distinguished Service Cross for actions during the Battle of the Bulge, where he single-handedly held a critical crossroads against an entire German company for 8 hours, preventing enemy breakthrough that would have cost thousands of American lives." Each word struck like a physical blow. The cocky sergeant who had led the mockery looked as if he'd been gut-punched, his face draining of all color as the reality of their conduct crashed over him like a cold wave. "He served in 2 wars," Martinez continued relentless. "For 25 years after his combat retirement, he was the chief marksmanship instructor for the 101st Airborne Division. The manual on precision shooting that was issued to every one of you, he wrote the foundational chapters based on lessons learned in actual Webb." The range coordinator stared with his mouth opening and closing soundlessly, finally understanding that he had just attempted to humiliate a living legend whose combat experience predated his own existence by decades. "The training standards you struggle to meet, the traditions you're supposed to uphold, the very wings on your chest. Men like Sergeant Major Vasquez forged them all in blood, sacrifice and unwavering commitment to excellence under fire." The crowd of civilian shooters had all stopped their activities, drawn to the incredible scene unfolding before them. They watched in awed silence as history walked among them, as legends became real people with names, faces, and quiet dignity that demanded respect. Colonel Chen finally lowered her salute and addressed her soldiers directly. "Sergeant Davis," she said, her voice carrying the chill of absolute command authority. "Step forward." Davis moved like a man walking to his own execution, his earlier confidence completely shattered. He came to a trembling version of attention before his colonel, sweat beading on his forehead despite the morning coolness. "You and your soldiers will render proper military courtesy to Sergeant Major Vasquez," the colonel ordered, her voice dangerously quiet. "Then you will apologize, individually and sincerely, for conduct that dishonors not just yourselves but every paratrooper who ever wore these wings." She stepped closer, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than any shout could convey. "Today you used the uniform he helped define to mock him. You are a disgrace to his legacy. You will correct that failure. Now." One by one the shamefaced paratroopers stepped forward, rendered sharp salutes, and offered their apologies with voices thick with genuine remorse. "My sincere apologies, Sergeant Major," Davis managed. "My conduct was inexcusable, sir." "I am deeply sorry, Sergeant Major," another soldier added. "I dishonored the uniform today." Tony listened to each apology with unchanging expression, acknowledging each soldier with a simple nod. When they finished, he looked not at them but at his rifle, then back to Colonel Chen. "They're young," he said, his voice carrying no trace of accusation or anger. "They see new tools and think that makes old lessons worthless. But the rifle doesn't make the soldier, Colonel. The soldier makes the rifle effective." He patted the scarred stock of his Garand with gentle affection. "This is just wood and steel. Same materials as their weapons, just arranged differently. What matters isn't the technology, it's the spirit behind it. Respect for the weapon, respect for the mission, respect for the men who depend on your accuracy." His wisdom was delivered without pride or condescension, simply stated as fact by a man who had lived these truths in circumstances that would break lesser spirits. The words hung in the morning air, more powerful than any lecture the colonel could have delivered. Webb finally found his voice, though it emerged as barely a whisper. "Sergeant Major, sir, I had no idea. I am deeply sorry for my disrespect." Tony turned his calm gaze to the range coordinator. "Son, you were doing your job as you understood it. Can't fault a man for that. But next time, maybe ask questions before making judgments." Colonel Chen consulted her watch, then addressed the assembled crowd. "Sergeant Major Vasquez has graciously agreed to conduct a marksmanship demonstration." What you're about to witness is precision shooting as it was developed and perfected by men who had no margin for error. She gestured toward First Sergeant Martinez, who approached carrying a ceremonial rifle case. He opened it with reverent care, revealing a museum-quality M1 Garand, pristine, perfectly maintained, a tribute weapon kept by the division for special occasions. Tony shook his head gently. "Thank you, First Sergeant, but I'll use my own. She and we've been through too much together to quit now." He looked at the weathered rifle in his hands, his thumb automatically finding that familiar scar in the stock. "This old girl has never let me down. Not about to start doubting her now." The crowd parted respectfully as Tony walked to the firing line. He didn't require a shooting table or high-tech support equipment. He simply dropped to one knee with fluid precision that belied his 84 years, settling into the classic rifleman's position with muscle memory earned through decades of practice. The metallic ping of the en-bloc clip sliding into the Garand's action was distinctive, iconic, a sound that spoke of American industrial might and the citizen soldiers who had carried these rifles across 2 oceans to victory. He raised the rifle without ceremony. No scope, no laser rangefinder, just the simple iron sights, a front blade and rear aperture that had served American soldiers faithfully for over a decade of global conflict. The 1,500-meter target was barely visible to the naked eye, a speck wavering in the heat shimmer. The young paratroopers with their advanced optics had been struggling to achieve consistent hits all morning. Antonio Vasquez became utterly still, his breathing slowed to the rhythm of a man who had learned to find perfect calm in the midst of chaos and violence. The entire range held its collective breath with him, sensing they were about to witness something extraordinary. The morning sounds, distant traffic, bird calls, the whisper of wind through the grass, all seemed to fade into reverent silence. Even the slight breeze appeared to pause, as if nature itself recognized the solemnity of the moment. Tony took one deep, controlled breath, released half of it, and let his finger find the trigger with practiced precision. Time seemed to slow as decades of muscle memory and hard-earned wisdom aligned into perfect execution. Then the Garand spoke, not with the sharp, aggressive crack of modern tactical rifles, but with the deep, authoritative boom that had echoed across the battlefields of 2 wars. The sound carried history, spoke of American determination, resonated with the voices of citizen soldiers who had answered their country's call when freedom hung in the balance. Seconds later, the unmistakable metallic ring of bullets striking steel target echoed back across the range, a perfect center hit on a target most of the observers could barely see with the naked eye. Tony didn't pause or celebrate. He simply acquired the target again through his iron sights, his movements economical and precise. Boom! Ring! 8 shots fired in less than 30 seconds, each one finding its mark with mechanical precision. As the final round fired, the empty en-bloc clip ejected with its own distinctive metallic cry, the famous Garand ping, landing in the grass beside him with a sound that had once signaled to enemies that an American soldier was reloading. Perfect silence followed, broken only by the distant echo fading across the Kentucky hills. Then a single pair of hands began to clap. It was PFC Rodriguez, his face filled with awe and profound respect for what he had just witnessed. His applause was slow, deliberate, carrying the weight of genuine admiration. Soon others joined him. The civilian shooters, the honor guard, First Sergeant Martinez, even Colonel Chen, all adding their voices to a growing wave of recognition and wonder for the elderly man kneeling with his ancient rifle. Finally, even the humbled paratroopers began to clap, their applause carrying the weight of newfound understanding and deep shame for their earlier conduct. As the ovation continued, Tony's mind drifted back not to battlefield memories but to a quiet moment afterward. He was 22 years old, sitting in a liberated French farmhouse, hands shaking from exhaustion and cold. His company first sergeant, a grizzled veteran named O'Malley, had examined the gouge in Tony's rifle stock where German shrapnel had struck during the artillery barrage. "That rifle saved your life today, son," O'Malley had said, his Irish accent thick with emotion. "You treat her right, and she'll keep saving it. She's more than wood and steel now. She's part of your story, and you're part of her." The scar wasn't damage, it was a covenant, a promise between soldier and weapon sealed in the crucible of combat. The consequences of that day were swift and comprehensive. Webb was terminated by the Range Management Company within 48 hours after Colonel Chen filed a formal complaint detailing the disrespectful treatment of a decorated veteran. His replacement was a retired Marine who instituted immediate protocols for recognizing and honoring military service members of all eras. The paratroopers from 2nd Platoon, found themselves assigned to a month-long intensive course that had nothing to do with jumping out of airplanes or tactical shoot. Instead, they spent their days in classrooms learning regimental history, maintaining historical weapons in the division museum, and volunteering at the local VA medical center. Their weekends were dedicated to community service projects specifically benefiting elderly veterans, yard work, home repairs, grocery shopping for those who could no longer drive. The assignment was designed not as punishment, but as education in humility and respect. Sergeant Davis, who had been the most vocal in his mockery, proved to be the most changed by the experience. 3 weeks into his remedial training, he approached First Sergeant Martinez with a request that surprised everyone. "First Sergeant, I'd like permission to visit Sergeant Major Vasquez at his home. I want to ask if he'd be willing to teach me about precision shooting, not just the technical aspects, but the mindset behind it." Martinez studied the young NCO for a long moment, seeing genuine transformation where arrogance had once lived. "That's between you and him, Sergeant, but if he agrees, you'd better approach it with the respect it deserves." 2 days later, Davis found himself sitting on Tony's front porch, listening to stories not of war and violence, but of the men who had served alongside him, their names, their dreams, their sacrifice. Tony spoke of precision shooting as a sacred responsibility, where every round fired carried the weight of lives that depended on accuracy. "The target isn't your enemy," Tony explained, his weathered hands carefully cleaning his Garand's action. "The target is just paper or steel. Your enemy is everything that tries to make you miss: fear, anger, ego, impatience. Master yourself, and the rifle becomes just a tool for expressing that mastery." Davis became a regular visitor, absorbing lessons that went far beyond marksmanship. He learned about leadership through quiet example, about the difference between confidence and arrogance, about the responsibility that came with wearing the uniform of an elite unit. The transformation was so profound that when his remedial training period ended, Davis requested assignment as an instructor at the division's marksmanship school. His superiors, impressed by his newfound maturity and teaching ability, approved the transfer. Within 6 months, he had integrated Tony's philosophical approach into the standard curriculum, teaching young soldiers that precision shooting was as much about character development as technical skill. The incident at the range became a case study taught throughout the WWII Airborne Division, used to illustrate the importance of respecting veterans and understanding the historical foundations of military tradition. 2 years after the confrontation that changed everything, Antonio Vasquez found himself busier in retirement than he had been during his active service. At 86, he had become the division's unofficial liaison to veteran organizations and a sought-after speaker at military schools throughout the Army. His small house near Fort Campbell had become a pilgrimage site for young soldiers seeking wisdom that couldn't be found in field manuals or technical publications. They would arrive unannounced, sit on his front porch, and listen to stories that connected them to a heritage they had never fully understood. The lessons went far beyond shooting techniques. Tony taught them about patience, observation, the importance of maintaining equipment, not just for functionality, but out of respect for the tools their lives depended upon. He showed them how precision shooting was ultimately about discipline, mental, physical, and spiritual. "Your rifle is only as good as the man behind it," he would tell them during informal training sessions in his backyard. Technology changes, equipment improves, but the fundamentals remain constant: steady position, natural point of aim, sight alignment, trigger control, and most importantly, the discipline to do it right every single time. One afternoon, as he sat cleaning his Garand on the front porch, a car pulled into his drive. Out stepped Colonel Chen, now retired and working as a civilian contractor training military instructors. "Tony," she said, settling into the chair beside him, "I wanted to thank you again for what you did that day at the range. Not just the shooting demonstration, but the grace you showed those young soldiers." Tony continued his methodical cleaning routine, his movements economical and precise. "They weren't bad kids, Sarah, just forgot where they came from. Sometimes people need reminding that they're part of something bigger than themselves. The Army has officially requested that you consider writing a comprehensive manual on precision shooting," Colonel Chen mentioned. "Not just the technical aspects, but the philosophy behind it. They want to capture your approach for future generations." Tony was quiet for a moment, considering the request while examining his rifle's barrel for any trace of residue. "I'll think about it, but honestly, the best lessons aren't learned from books. They're learned from experience, passed down from one soldier to another." He set the rifle aside and looked at his former student. "What matters isn't that they remember my name, or my story. What matters is that they understand the responsibility that comes with wearing the uniform, carrying the weapon, taking the oath." As evening approached, Tony reflected on the unexpected turn his retirement had taken. He had spent decades in quiet service, content to tend his garden and occasionally help young soldiers understand the deeper meaning of their profession. Now, through a confrontation he never sought and recognition he never desired, his knowledge had found new purpose. The old lessons hadn't just survived. They had proven essential for understanding what military service truly meant. Sometimes he thought, the best legacy isn't what you accomplished for yourself, but what you help others understand about honor, duty, and the quiet pride that comes from serving something greater than your own ambition.